Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for being here with us today for this new episode of our gender gap webinar from an ideological point of view. So, the gender gap we are going to speak about is not so much the salary gender gap or the life situation gender gap, but more precisely the ideological one. And for that, we would like to have insights from the last elections because it gives quantitative data, which we can rely on to elaborate on this question, but also more largely on the work of the three speakers we are very, very happy to have with us today. So first, we are really happy to discuss with Sara Farris, who is a professor of sociology, specializing in feminism and Marxism, and she's also well known for the concept she's been elaborating on, which is femo-nationalism. Hello, Sarah. Nice to see you here. We will also be speaking with Francesca Feo. She's a PhD and expert of gender politics. Really happy to see you again, also, Francesca. She's been there in our previous episode. Also with David Broder. Very happy to see you again. He's an historian, an editor for Jacobin, and as well for the Transform Review. So, and maybe I can introduce myself as well. I am Anaïs Fley. I am a facilitator of Transform Europe, and I'm focusing in my work on the far right, but also on diverse subjects. So in the last episode, we noted that younger generations were generally more progressive and radical. At the same time, the far right is a political option that is increasingly popular with both men and women. However, among those who claim political affiliation, among people who claim a political affiliation, there is a large proportion of women now who identify not only as liberal but also as leftists and often as radical leftists, with a large proportion of men identifying as far right on the other hand. So on one side, men who are cut off from collective solidarity networks and who are experiencing a situation of decline, be it real or perceived, identify with the myth of the self-made man who follows a life path forged by effort, sacrifice, and the quest for self-making. And they identify a competitive threat in the most precarious. So those, for example, on welfare, who will take advantage of everything with it without paying. So the poorest, the immigrants, the racialized people. And women, on the other hand, see themselves more as belonging to a collective identity that transcends them and that has the collective capacity to change things as women. But this reality materializes, in individual lives as violence against which they must defend themselves as well. So I will invite you now to discuss, critique, and put these initial points into perspective. But also putting it in link with the changes in the far right discourse and in the far right in general since the last century, because only roughly speaking, and I will maybe let you elaborate on that and give us your input. We could say that to sum up this huge question, there have been a change, a shift from a militia fascism to now neoliberal hegemony, and it also totally transformed the far right and how it functions and how people also feel support the far right on what basis. So also this change influences obviously the ideological gender gap, And so, yeah, I will maybe let you speak on that. So I would propose as an order first Sarah, then Francesca, and then David, and then I will let you react on your interventions. Many thanks. So Sarah, I let you the floor.
Thank you very much, Anaïs. Thanks for inviting me. And I will go straight into my arguments because I know that we don't have too much time. I also want to say that I'm not going to speak too much about the electoral gender gap. That's really not my expertise. What I want to reflect on instead is based on my work on femonationalism. I will try to speak about some developments that I have seen in this field over the last few years, with a particular focus on the UK. In my work, just very, very briefly, for those of you who might not be familiar with this term and with this work, femonationalism is a term that I used to refer to the ways in which nationalist far-right parties mobilize some feminist ideas of gender equality, particularly in the context of their anti-immigration and anti-Islam campaigns. And my work was focused on France, the Netherlands, and Italy. So the book that developed this concept was published in 2017. And very interestingly for me, I have never received as many really requests for interviews or to ask for people asking me for comments as I did over the last 12 months. Particularly from Spain and France, but also Italy, which also tells me that clearly this is a phenomenon, if you want to call it that way, that is clearly, I would say, intensifying and spreading also in other parts of Europe. I also want to say that some of the things I will say today are, as I said, focused on the UK, on the British context, which was not very much of a femo-nationalist context until at least when I did my research in the 2010s. And I would say since 2019, 2020 instead is becoming, this ideological formation that I call femo-nationalism has definitely intensified. The last thing is some of the, if you like, things I will say are also based on a recent Horizon project on which I'm working, and I'm putting the link here in the chat. So if people are interested in seeing this work, they can have a look to the website. We just begun. We began in February. So we are at a stage of data collection. But just again, to give a very, very brief overview, this is a project that is looking specifically at far-right youth organizations in 8 different European countries, and with a specific focus on how the youth, the far-right youth, broadly defined, is using gender, how they mobilize gender ideas, but how also gender is playing a role in their political socialization. So said that, I will go more specifically into my paper, which is actually going to focus on one specific development of the ways in which the far right mobilizes gender, and is the specific anti-transgender arguments. So I'm going to call this talk Anti-Transgender Femo-Nationalism. Femo-nationalism, or the mobilization of feminist ideas of gender equality by nationalists in the context of the racist politics, as I defined it already, and as I said already, is clearly on the rise. The trope of Muslim and migrant men sexually threatening women has been key in the success of the AfD in Germany, since 2016 in particular, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and for example, in France, as we might remember, Bardella and Le Pen devoted key moments of their presidential campaign to address women's safety allegedly threatened by Arabs and migrants. The same is now happening in the UK, which, as I also mentioned briefly, until recently had been less amenable to the femo-nationalist rhetoric. Here too, Reform UK and the wider far-right constellation have massively invested in the politics of fear, resentment and scapegoating, according to which migrants are especially guilty of being sexual predators. But alongside these forms of racialization of sexism, the multiplication of female leaders in right-wing parties, which is also one important aspect of femo-nationalism, I think we should pay attention also to other ways in which the nationalist weaponization of sexual violence and the use of sexual threats is taking place. So today I want to focus on one of these ways, namely the intensification of transphobia, especially against trans women. Since the late 2010s, the far right has been targeting trans people and transgender rights in unprecedented ways. Here, the UK has been at the center of international attention, particularly due to the vigor of debates about gender self-identification in schools, sports, and public spaces. Alongside increasing hostility in the political mainstream, far-right groups and activists have ramped up their actions against trans rights, with a particular pushback against the diversification of sex and relationships education under the guise of protecting young people. What we can see increasingly in the far-right landscape is that while discussions on gender can be quite fluid, often instrumental, but also ambivalent, depending upon the specific group, the political goal the group is trying to achieve, and the context in which gender issues are discussed, there is absolutely no ambivalence when it comes to transgender. What does it mean? While the far right has traditionally been and remains very hostile to LGBTQ plus people in general, in recent years, some far right groups have sought to portray themselves as protectors of LGBT rights, as long as gay and lesbians are defined as cis women and men. So let me give you some examples to give you the sense of this new intensity against transgender rights in particular. In 2021, the British newspaper regulator, the Independent Press Standards Association, found a 400% increase in the coverage of trans issues between 2014 and 2019. Similarly, a report by Mermaids, which is a charity supporting transgender, non-binary, and gender-diverse children and their families, reported a rise in mentions of transgender children in the British press between 2018 and 2020, and that the majority of coverage was negative. In the US, in the final months of the elections, the Trump campaign launched a series of attack ads targeting presidential opponent Kamala Harris. These ads concluded with the line, "Harris is for them, they, Trump is for you," aiming to portray Trump's Democratic opponents as disconnected from working class people and preoccupied with woke DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And it needs to be noted that these ads cost the Trump campaign over $215 million. And what is also interesting is really the speed at which Trump is really implementing these new anti-trans policies. For example, signed on the very day of his inauguration, Trump's executive order defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government requires all parts of the federal government to share the same definition of sex, which, according to them, is an individual's immutable biological classification as either male or female. And here, for the Trump administration, female means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the large reproductive cells, and male instead produce the small reproductive cells. This order, at once that followed on sports, DEI, education, and the military, collectively constitute an attempt to exclude transgender people from public life altogether. What was unexpected, though, as I also said already, was the speed with which agencies all across the country put this order into effect. And here I just like to quote Sara Farris, who is a British transgender writer, and in her recent book, This Transgender Issue, she noted how the rhetoric about trans people dramatically changed in recent years. As she writes, we were no longer portrayed as the ridiculous but unthreatening provincial mechanic who was having a sex swap. Now we were depicted as the proponents of a powerful new ideology that was capturing institutions and dominating public life. Now, while Fey writes specifically about mainstream media, the far right has adopted a very similar language, fed by conspiracy theorist thinking in particular. And it does not focus so much on individual trans people, but views the transgender equality movement as a monolithic, powerful, and disruptive force with a secretive agenda. Now, in this context, and as I also anticipated a little bit at the beginning of this presentation, it is especially trans women who are targeted. The far right presents trans women as dangerous men who disguise as women in order to molest real women in public toilets or in order to rob them of their medals in sport competitions. Once again, and I would say here in perfect femo-nationalist fashion, the far right instrumentalizes women's rights and issues around women's safety to ramp up their politics of hate and fear. Indeed, as several commentators have noticed, there are many similarities in the ways the far right represents and vilifies trans women and transgender people more generally here, and the way in which they vilify and stigmatize Muslim and immigrant men. Transgender people, to give you some examples, transgender people, like Muslim men, are represented as a danger for children. Just as Muslims are allegedly the main figures involved in grooming gangs and sexual abusing minors, so do transgender people, particularly the so-called trans lobby, try to pervert children's minds with gender ideology. Trans women in particular, just like Muslim men, are allegedly a sexual threat for women. Transgender people, like Muslim communities, threaten the biological reproduction of the white race and are thus increasingly appearing as characters in various great replacement far-right conspiracies. But there are also important resonances with anti-Semitism. Transgender people, just like Jews, are represented as a powerful international lobby that wants to dictate the political and cultural agenda of the West and normalize their perverted lifestyles. One of the main functions of this artifact, called the transgender threat in the hand of the far right, is clearly to provide a powerful scapegoat. As it's been already very well put by several scholars, including Eric Maroney, Jules Jill Peterson, Judith Butler, and others, the myth of the transgender threat allows the far right both to reinforce its authoritarian project and to enact a politics of deflection and misdirection. In particular, I will quote Jill Peterson, who says that trans misogyny is highly compatible with right-wing authoritarian politics because it aims to preserve or entrench existing social hierarchies through the production of an imagined threat from those with the least demonstrated power. Butler makes this point as well when they argue that anti-gender politics are implicated in a broader authoritarian project. The right's promotion of the notion that gender poses a destructive threat is a way to instill existential fear, which can then be exploited by those seeking to enhance state powers, as Butler says, and return to a more secure patriarchal order. As pointed out also by Maroney, both Jill Peterson's imagined threats and Butler's phantasm of gender, which is the way that Butler calls it in the later book. So these two concepts acknowledge the centrality of anti-trans politics to the present moment of political reaction. But I would add that this analysis to point to a more insidious far-right politics that one could call deflect and conquer. It is a politics that enables the right to sidetrack from their own inability to address real problems by instead accusing the left, for example, for caring about needless, not urgent, and even dangerous issues and people, instead of addressing those more serious issues. It should be noted at this point that this is also a point sometimes made in left-wing circles when it's claimed that trans issues divert attention away from what are presented as supposedly more critical working-class concerns. I think that we need to pay instead to attend to the political economy of the politics of scapegoating and this politics of deflect and conquer, not so much and certainly not, in fact, as a sort of economic reductionism. So we don't need to do the political economy because we always need to, in a way, go back to the economic aspects. But I think it's much more about understanding the way in which these political, cultural, and symbolic processes are essentially interwoven with more classically economic and material processes. So I believe an important avenue to analyze the political economy of anti-trans politics today is provided by social reproduction feminism. Several scholars, including Judith Butler, have noted how anti-trans messages target social sites that have been destabilized, deregulated, and defunded through decades of neoliberal policies, schools, healthcare, and the family. Indeed, sexual and gender education in schools and gender-affirming surgery are presented as useless luxuries that only serve the interests of the trans lobby and take resources away from services that instead have been cut, desubsidized or privatized, as the right propaganda goes. Over 40 years of neoliberal policies leading to the so-called crisis of social reproduction have also recentered the family and the private households as a sort of last bastion of the safety net that once provided, at least in part and at least in some countries, by social services. The nuclear heterosexual family is thus reconfigured by the far right as a space of security, certainties, and dependability that transgender politics is threatening. But while attending to question of social reproduction, I think is crucial and is being pointed out already by several scholars, I believe there are also important questions that remain and for which I think we need also as Marxist feminists, we need to develop better tools. And here really I want, in a way, more ask questions rather than give you answers. These are questions that are really on which I am working at the moment. And a question that I keep really wondering about is why are trans women in particular so instrumental to this politics of deflection and scapegoating by the right? And to put it more specifically, given the far-right obsession with women's bodies as bearers of biological reproduction, why does the right appear to be less concerned with trans men? So if you start digging, as I unfortunately have to do also for this project, I say unfortunately because when you start looking more closely into the far-right discourses, obviously it gets really ugly. So when you start digging into discourses on gender ideology by the far right, I think what becomes apparent is that the majority of examples used to illustrate the supposed danger of transgender people refer to them as potential rapists, but also as somewhat absurd, incomprehensible biological men who think it is possible to ignore what they have between their legs. If you scroll down, for example, tweet pages of people like Tommy Robinson, all the comments you find is a mix of these biological men are dangerous to these men are ridiculous, they have to acknowledge they are men. So here I would like to suggest that we need to attend very carefully to this indictment by the far right of trans women as expressing in a way also contempt and betrayal of men. Paradoxically, and although they are represented by TERFs, as a threat for feminism, the far right in a way seems to me to be unwittingly charging trans women for being precisely the best allies of feminists, for they perform not just the symbolic but the real castration of men that feminism, at least in the far right minds, has always dreamt of realizing. So anti-trans women politics, I think, requires us to go deeper into our understanding of neoliberal capitalism, but this as a stage of accumulation that has led to the crisis of social reproduction, but also to the crisis of masculinity. And a lot of people are writing about this. So the centrality of the political economy of the crisis of masculinity becomes apparent when we think again of the parallels between far-right transphobia and Islamophobic anti-immigration politics. As I already emphasized in the book on femonationalism, the various attacks on migration, which are central to the far right, are not equally aimed against female migration. This had already become apparent in several European countries and is now also very clear in the UK. So, for example, on the occasion of the closure of the care worker visa by the Labour Party last summer, on account of the visa having been abused, this was a specific visa for care workers, 90% of which are women. So the Labour Party decided that this visa is going to be closed down. So Reform UK on this occasion was the only party to stand against the visa closure, claiming that the NHS and care homes need these foreign female workers to keep going. If female migrant workers are not represented as an economic threat for female and male workers, it is also because in the far-right imageries, British or white women, unlike men, are not constructed as workers. It is instead migrant men that are represented as endangering the identity and livelihoods of white male workers, those who post-Fordist neoliberalism has stripped of their role as primary breadwinners. I then wonder, and this is really my conclusion, in this scenario, could it be that the far right is trying to present trans women as the final stroke against this class of economically emasculated white men who are now even threatened with, again, symbolically, but it's interesting, with real castration, which is really what this trans obsession against the trans women seems to me also to amounts to. So with a few exceptions, and here I'm thinking especially of the work of the late Kevin Floyd, but also Jordana Matlon, very few scholars, particularly Marxist scholars, have attended to the political economy of masculine gender formations and masculinity more generally as central to neoliberal capitalist restructuring. And I think this is now more than ever an urgent task that can potentially allow us to explore gender as a social relation of production and reproduction, but also as a crucial political battlefield in the current struggle against the far right, which is more and more looking like what do we want to call it, post-fascism, neo-fascism, but I think we also will need to attend to this conversation about these new faces of fascism. And I will close here. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I haven't been too long.
No, really many thanks for this very insightful input. I will directly leave the floor to Francesca to give her input.
Thank you very much, Anaïs, for giving me the floor, and also thank you very much, Sara, for a super over comprehensive introduction of. Actually, I will have a lot of points afterwards, but I will probably try to stick to my intervention now, and maybe we can go there in the discussion, because of course these open super interesting perspectives. And I think I thought that to start, I would have probably, given the kind of composition of the floor today, stick to my role as the demand side expert of the situation, even though it's not really exactly what I am. But of course, in my research, I've also, especially recently, I've been dealing a lot with basically demand side, so public opinions, and how voting for far right is actually shaped. What are the factors that are more important and so on and so forth, with a specific focus on gender and gender attitudes, also attitudes toward feminism and so on and so forth. And I think like in our last discussion, I tried to, in a way, situate a bit better, like in a less kind of less sensationalistic way than it's usually done in media's outlets. I try to kind of situate and give us coordinates to understand the widening of the gender gap, especially among younger generations, within an historical longer trend. So I kind of, I mentioned the fact that, of course, like gender gaps in voting behavior have been there since the 70s. And actually, as a result of like the introduction of welfare states in most of the like Western European democracies, in a way, women started voting more social democratic than conservative as they used to be in the decades before. So in a way, we have to contextualize also where is happening now and what is happening now, especially with young men and young women, I think in kind of in a broader perspective. And I think so was basically my one of the points that I tried to raise last time was that most of the gender gaps that we see today, and especially when we talk about gender gap in voting, is connected to like women's and young women's becoming more and more progressive over time, especially in some cases. Southern Europe is one of the one important case, but this is a general trend that we can actually generalize to Western democracies. And yes, we have evidence, and I mean, there has been like research conducted, especially for like the last European elections rounds, for example, in 2024, that actually showed that also like young men, so Generation Z, this is what we are talking about. And this is also like the first part of like, we are actually able to, gather information about this generation now, just because they are, they are now 18 years old and plus, so they are voting, so we can actually capture their behaviors and so on and so forth whenever we use survey data as a method of investigation. And so there has been like evidence that yes, like a young part, like so younger men are kind of tending to vote for the far right to a certain degree when we look at this data comparatively. And what is probably like even more worrisome or like kind of gives us like a point of that deserve attention is not necessarily on the actual voting behavior, but on like a measure that we usually talk about, like that we usually kind of consider in political science analysis, that is like the propensity to vote. So actually, when we look at the propensity to vote, so kind of potential choice in the electorate, we see that actually the far right is a very viable option for like a lot of young men, much more than than those that actually vote for the far right. So this is kind of a data that I would like to put there because I think it's an interesting, it's something that we need to think to take into account. So basically the potential, base of the far right among that cohort, it's even broader, and there are obviously some factors that could even push this kind of this group to actually vote for far right actors in the future. So this is just one point. But then I move to the kind of more like gender attitudes side of the story. So one thing is about voting behavior, and this is of course problematic in and of itself. And I think I try to portray like a bit of a kind of more positive pictures when it comes to attitudes. And I would like to attitudes, especially towards gender equalities and so on, because we still see that the younger generation, so millennials, but especially Gen Z, they are actually still very progressive and very progressive, more progressive than like older generations. And this is something that we need to take into account. They are not growing conservative as such or as a general rule, but there are few things that of course create contentions and brings, so few specific aspects that create contentions and brings what can be defined as a, if you want, like as a gender affective polarization. So the fact that, basically like like among the youth, there is more kind of the opposite of homophilic feelings, so kind of more dislikable feelings vis-a-vis themselves, like as gender groups. And this was a bit confused, but I will try to explain a bit better. But just let me give you like a couple of data. So, and I think it's interesting actually also focusing on the UK. Just a few days ago, Ipsos published like results from a major UK survey, and they found they were actually exploring exactly these gender perceptions or perceptions of gender relations among like young generations. And one of the findings that I think like immediately struck my point, like my attention, was that at the end, like only 32% of the public generally, so across generation, think that there is much tensions between men and women. So the idea of this inevitable, gender conflict or gender culture war that we have been listening to in the media sometimes is not necessarily like so prominent as it is portrayed. Now, having said that, we can among young people, the picture is a bit sharper, that a bit more polarized. And this is, I think, like an interesting data, because 58% of young women aged between 16 and 29 say that they experience tensions between men and women. So they see this kind of tension growing with men. Whereas for boys and young men, for the boys, it's much lower. So it's only 34%. So it's actually women that perceive that there is a tension with the opposite gender, not necessarily the other way around. So gender polarization is not universal, but it's actually specific to the young cohort, and within the young cohort, specifically to women. And then I think another data, and something that we kind of discussed as well with David last time, was about, okay, where is this coming from? And of course, we talked a lot about the crisis of masculinity and the fact that, especially young men as a group might perceive an unseen threat or threat to their position as well in a society that, of course, is growing more progressive over time. And I was actually pleased. That was kind of an assumption. I didn't really have data to show that, but basically this survey that I consulted a few days ago actually shows exactly data supporting this statement. So when asked whether their generation will have a better life than their parents, only the 20% of young men believe that this is true, contrary to the 57% of young women. So I think this is a very good data to actually show that it's kind of, status deprivation, let me use this term, is actually much more present in the mind and horizon of young boys or young men rather than young women, right? And this makes sense because, of course, in a way, this resonates very strongly to the fact that kind of young men are navigating a profound crisis of expectations, both materials and symbolic, obviously. So, and this connects with things that have been raised already. Of course, they are, as we know from research, that young men are structurally more precarious than previous generations of men, and yet they are still socialized into believing that they should be economically central, stable, self-sufficient, both economically and, and emotionally, and so on. And so when this premise collapses, of course, in a way, insecurity becomes something that is very prominent. And this is, I think, where far-right discourse is very good at tapping into this dimension, this kind of insecurity, and providing narratives that are potentially much more easier to follow or easier to believe or to embrace compared to the narratives that the radical left at the moment is able to provide. And I will try to be quick, maybe. So these are, I think, very interesting data, but then let me add a little bit more into the whole gender polarization or affective polarization. Of course, there is a very big narrative, and we touched upon that before, about the role of feminism. Are all men or younger men becoming anti-feminist as such? Actually, again, I mentioned already last time that there are structural explanations for this, in the sense that it's not we don't see the existence of anti-feminist sentiment per se, but it's more related to kind of, if we kind of unpacked anti-feminist sentiment, we really see that younger generation have a stronger, are more skeptical or towards feminism when this kind of translates into basically gender equality mechanism or positive actions, gender quotas, basically, but not even in the political realm, but really in the labor market. So when in the dimensions and in the space where competition is felt the most, which is a labor market in which finally young men and young women are basically competing for the first time in history on an equal ground, we see that, so research, especially like research by Geffion Off, has shown that this is the kind of dimension in which like a lot of like kind of anti-feminist sentiment emerge on the side of young men. So they are basically against positive actions on the labor market because they feel threatened in the possibility of achieving like, you know, economic goals that were before probably easier for them just because of a kind of society that was structured along a patriarchal line. And but as a general, let me get back to the survey that I've been quoting so far. As a general kind of, you know, sentiment towards feminism, we actually don't see like a very like strong polarization. Still 46% of young men say that feminism has done more good than harm, which is, by the way, a 10-point increase from last year. So again, as the time goes by, in a way, younger generation are becoming also more positive with vis-a-vis feminism. And again, this kind of, I think it's a point, like, or a point of discussion for the audience, I guess. Sorry, I have some chats going on. I mean, the depiction of feminism as a threat is something that the far right is kind of, again, discursively constructing. They are very good at producing this type of discourse, and I'm sure that these discourses have an impact, but we are still so through social medias and so on, but this is not like, it's something that we need to take into account, like, when we look at public opinion though, and especially for like the younger generation, this doesn't seem to be necessarily like such a widespread narrative, or not something that is completely like bought, right? Or not yet, in a way. And then, like, let me just go through like another couple of data. Another interesting finding, I think, from Ipsos is that, again, like, you know, more than half of the public, basically, and especially like a strong majority among young men, 62%, believe that young men and women have more in common than they divide them. So again, we don't really have like so much evidence about the kind of gender culture wars and so on. And so now, this is basically the point in which I think like far right narratives can actually enter, right? And as we argued like last time, far right actors are very effective at politicizing male insecurity, giving it a language of deservedness, nostalgia, and status restoration. They promote the idea that society has turned against the hardworking, decent young men, and that feminist, more diverse policies are part of the problem. And this is the point about neoliberalism, of course, they do not really address any structural inequality, but they feel emotionally, you know, they kind of, you know, tell something compelling, resonant stories that attach kind of meanings or provide like a kind of a grid of understanding for sometimes men frustrations, I think. So this is one of the point that kind of connects to neoliberalism, and I think that's probably just to kind of add like the last layer vis-a-vis and then I stop, vis-a-vis the kind of discussion of today. The point was about, okay, how far right, far right, what's the linkages between far right and economic policies, right? And we really do know that, especially today, like far right actors, even mainstream actors, so political parties and so on, they are very much embedded in the neoliberal agenda. I mean, if we consider their economic policy, but also anything connected to welfare and other issues, they are pretty much sitting in the paradigm of producing like neoliberalist politics, individualistic politics, policies, and so on. So there is no critique of neoliberal economic policies, and this is probably why, in a way, they're, to a certain degree, I would even argue that they cannot even consider radical from that point of view, because they are actually sitting in the mainstream economic agenda that of our times, in a way. And I mean, one of the examples from like media, Italian media, I think like a week or two ago, Giorgia Meloni, in one of our prime ministers, saying there has been like a discussion about, you know, wealth taxations. That is something that has emerged and popped up in public debate. And of course, like her kind of reaction to even the idea of wealth taxation was don't you worry, this will never happen during like our government in Italy. So this is of course something in a way like kind of portraying this government, and in a general way like far-right government, as basically protection and protectors of, you know, rich classes, capitalist classes, and definitely not so much in favor of like strata of the population, milieus, and groups that are instead struggling or are crushed and squeezed from the like difficulties that basically neoliberal economy neoliberal economy like kind of set up, right? And this is kind of like a hooked on David work. I mean, he knows much better than that. Of course, it wasn't always like that. There has been periods in history where like far-right ideologies and fascism was also like in a way more radical and more like non in line with neoliberal policies. Even in the Italian story of like post-fascism, we saw that there were branches that were more revolutionary from the point of view I'm talking about, but this is probably like, I mean, Pino Rauti's branch of inside the Italian social movement that was the predecessor party of Fratelli d'Italia today, Brothers of Italy. Of course, there were few branches that were much more revolutionary, but kind of like also like in a way in favor of more state redistribution and so on, but this kind of faded away. And I think I will just conclude this. And I think I would love like a couple of questions for later of like, okay, but what does this imply for actually, you know, gender gaps and gender polarization? But we can probably discuss it a little bit later. Thank you again for the time.
Many, many thanks, Francesca. Again, I will directly give the floor to David.
Well, thanks, Anaïs, for chairing and for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here, and I hope I don't repeat too much things I said last time, but I will build on the discussion we had in the last such seminar. So basically, I'm going to talk a bit about the reality of the ideological gender gap as expressed in electoral politics, where that's happening, and the way in which it's used politically as an idea. Right. Also in connection to the idea of the way that young people vote or the way that working class people vote as like stereotyped ideas that are themselves used as tools of political mobilization. Okay. So, of course, a lot of the scholarly literature focuses on the idea of a modern gender gap as opposed to a traditional gender gap. So in the sense that in many electoral systems, we can see that historically, through the first few decades of universal suffrage, including female suffrage, in countries like France and Britain, West Germany, women voted slightly more conservatively than men. And then since the 1970s, that started to shift and become the other way around. And now looking at certain electoral systems today, particularly among younger voters, we see this tendency radicalize. So with the decline, in particular in the countries I mentioned, with the decline of sort of old mass parties and the rise of new electoral options, there's a kind of greater polarization in which young women are more likely to vote for example, left-wing parties in France, the Greens in Britain, Die Linke in Germany, whereas young men are more likely to vote for Reform UK, Le Pen's Rassemblement National, Alternative for Deutschland. The evidence from these cases seems so extreme as to tell a very compelling story. So, for example, in the German federal election in February, if I'm right, the vote for Die Linke among young women under 30s was more than twice as much as the young male vote for Die Linke, the left-wing party. And among the AfD, there was a similar polarization, but the other way around. Right. So maybe overall in these electoral systems, there's not an enormous difference between the vote for the sort of main social democratic or centre-right parties by gender, but among the younger voters, the votes for the apparently more radical options is much more pronounced. There's also a critical literature which questions quite how general this phenomenon is, right? Are the British or French or German cases actually so paradigmatic. So there's an interesting study in the European Sociological Review by Richard Nansteel and Ansgar Hudde, which suggests that while these cases may be considered totemic, in fact, they're unrepresentative of Europe in general. The argument of their essay and of the data which they marshal is based on how under 30s identify politically, how they place themselves on a left-right scale. And what they find is that in both some of the major countries of Southern Europe and in almost all of the newer European Union member states, basically, on the whole, the ex-Eastern Bloc, this gender divide is much less pronounced than in Northern and Western Europe. Their conclusion from this data is an interesting one, and one worth thinking about, which is that in countries where gender equality is more of a reality, both they mean Northern and Western Europe, the gender gap is more pronounced. Right. So in their argument, they also draw on some slightly questionable premises. So, for example, they say, well, Italy, maybe Italy is placed among the group where the gender gap is less pronounced. So they reason, well, Italy, Catholic country, conservative, perhaps this explains gender equality is less. But I think the argument is interesting in a sense, not counterintuitive, but almost compelling, right? It links a bit to something that Francesca said, which is that where the of course, it's not just about the labor market, but really where gender equality is more real, where the patriarchal arrangement or assumptions or relations in society are more strongly challenged, then the backlash and the anti-feminist backlash is stronger and takes more pronounced political form. So it would make sense in this argument that perhaps if a third of young men vote for the AFD or Reform UK or Front National or any of these parties, what that partly does is express a backlash by young men who feel the heat of competition, feel that they ought to enjoy some sort of priority, feel that they ought to have their future laid out for them, but it's being denied. And as they see it, the reason is that women's rights have gone too far. They suffer from some sort of unjust distortion of meritocracy, perhaps through some sort of affirmative action programs, or perhaps things like, for example, the role of the education system in producing a meritocracy, which they see as unfair or skewed against them. There are important caveats to be put on this reading. So, for example, in Hudde and Nensteel's article, Poland, for example, is counted among the countries where gender equality is less advanced, and therefore the gender gap and the gender gap in their data is lesser. This should also, however, lead us to draw into question the kind of methodology that asks people to place themselves on a left-right scale, right? To identify their political choices as a matter of belonging to a left or right-wing identity. After all, if we look at the data from the most recent Polish general election in 2023, there was an extremely marked gender divide in party choice among young women and men, at least according to the data we have available. Right. So one poll ahead of the recent Polish general election had the far-right party Confederation at 46% support among young male voters. Right. Confederation isn't even the main far-right party in Poland. Law and Justice is more significant, but Confederation is a more radical party made up of monarchists, libertarian, right-wingers, more openly fascist elements. And this party organizes a very strong anti-feminist backlash among young men. Right, 46% of the vote. Among young women, it scored 16%, according to the same poll. So, of course, what this also leads us to think is perhaps, well, or at least to pose the question is the reason why the anti-feminist backlash is so strong because of the strong position of women or the reality of gender equality, Or is it rather, in fact, just because of the politicization of the existence of a strong and visible conflict over issues related to gender? Right. So if we might think not of Poland as a country which has which counts among the leading states in Europe for having strongly established gender equality in law, but it is certainly one of the European countries which has very strong and visible political struggles over questions very conventionally related to gender, for example, reproductive rights, abortion, if we think of the strikes in recent years, and so on. So it seems obvious that there too, the existence of publicly visible conflict over gender, and even in of course, all manner of political issues can be gender, but I mean, even the politicization of an issue like, you know, the very strong posing of the issue of women's place in society in an issue like reproductive rights, evidently has an important role also in sorting the party political field and the voting choices of young people voting for the first time. This could, of course, pose the question of, well, you know, are they voting according to, are they voting because of, you know, identity, gender, because of struggles over feminism and anti-feminism, or are they voting because of their position in the labor market, because of their material conditions? Of course, I'm sure all of us here agree that those issues are not counterposed, right? They're bound up together. And I think it's important, and, you know, it's obviously important to think about the specific ways that that plays out. One of the things I'm writing about at the moment is the idea of class identity and the use of working classness as a form of identity politics. Okay, we can say historically, class has always been talked about politically through the prism of stereotype, through so-called exemplary figures, through certain ideas of what it is to have for working class people to be materially successful, what it means, as the question Francesca mentioned, you know, what is it to believe in a better future for one generation than the past, and how does that relate to kind of class-defined expectations? I think one important way of thinking about this is the way in which political parties themselves generate these ideas of class, right? So like in Britain, for example, it's now extremely common, in fact, ubiquitous, for the idea of a working class vote, a working class choice, to be uniquely associated with the far right, right? So an example I always say is, you know, if there was a strike on the London Underground, the metro system, right? There is no chance that the BBC or the Guardian or any liberal media would refer to that as an example of working class politics. If there's a riot against a hotel used to house migrants, where there's been sexual violence against women, and locals are angry about it and want the hotel to expel the migrants, that is almost uniquely framed as an example of working class attitudes and culture, right? There's the association of the working classness with a certain set of values and assumptions. And it's something that Reform UK in Britain is very effectively mobilizing, right? Talking itself up as, you know, the authentic expression of working class people. That, of course, includes many aspects of stereotype related to attitudes towards, for example, nationality, gender roles, as well as the economic sphere and economic values. I think it's important in that sense to talk about an area which was mentioned by Sara, which is the idea of the role of the home. In particular, the idea, you know, Sara kind of referred to the idea of perhaps, you know, in the age of, if I'm not mischaracterizing, in the sort of age of neoliberalism, or you know, the sort of postmodern world, the idea of the home, you know, conservative idea of the home as a kind of haven, right? A kind of a protected space that is one's own and separated from the conflicts that exist in like postmodern society, in the cosmopolitan urban space, and so on. And I think it's interesting to think about how that idea, the idea of creating the haven, is associated with ideas of the self-made man, the idea of personal advancement, of home ownership itself as the model of working class success. Because what we see in far-right parties, which are now boasting about their working class support, is that it can be an illusion to think about their working class support in terms of welfarism, or in terms of them protecting some sort of social democracy, but limited to nationals, this kind of idea. Because what we also see is that these parties in many ways mobilize a quite contradictory idea of working class success, which fuses some of the promises of neoliberalism itself with ideas of the sort of male breadwinner model, in some ways inherited from the Fordist era. So rather than a radical departure from neoliberalism, with its idea of, hard work is what you need to succeed in the market, to become a homeowner, to become a mini capitalist, and so on. What the far right, I think, is offering is the idea that it is going to make real on that promise by removing the various sort of woke, DEI, bureaucratic statist barriers that exist, that basically others are being unfairly rewarded by a system based on the educational meritocracy and so on, and basically the losers are hardworking young men who want to make the same career advancement as their parents did, but they're not able to because ideology is holding them back. I think this is also somewhat connected to the question of the environment, and it's interesting to think about the connection in that sense too, in the sense that one of the ways in which the sort of productive idea of the hardworking young men, one of the barriers to the sort of idealized productivist order is indeed the imposition of sort of environmental red tape, green regulations, a sort of supposed like anti-growth model, which is basically suppressing job creation and not allowing young men to succeed. And in far-right discourse, basically posed as that is posed as part of a sort of a blob of sort of bureaucratic statist intervention with woke and controlling ideas that's suppressing economic activity. And in far-right discourse, particularly if we look at, for example, a party like the Rassemblement National or Fratelli d'Italia, this is often combined with the idea that, or for example, the BBB in the Netherlands, this is combined with the idea that those who own the land, or farmers themselves, are in fact kind of stewards of the natural order, that they're sort of protecting the spaces where they live and work, and that sort of urban cosmopolitan society with its green ideology is illegitimately sort of invading the space they ought to control with its rules, with its regulations, with its ideology. So when Francesca mentioned nostalgia, I think what's very compelling in the far-right messaging for many young men is precisely the idea of a sort of return to a world which never existed, but in which the sort of small proprietor, right, the young, hardworking man is able to make his career, to own his little corner of the world, and rule it as a patriarch, and basically that is being sort of shaken up and destroyed by modern society. So the critique isn't of neoliberalism as such, but rather a kind of promise to realize it in a way which advantages them, rather than, as they see it, rewarding illegitimate others. if we think of a work like Inglehart and Norris's Rising Tide, which talks about the way in which post-industrial societies have produced the changes in post-industrial societies, such as the rise of educational capital, the rise of labor mobility, the growing importance of service sector roles, and so on. I think what it conveys is a sense in which the sort of post-industrial society has shaken up gender roles and created a stronger sense of competition. And I think that what far-right parties are able to offer as a sort of stereotyped idea of class, and one that attracts a large minority of young male voters, is precisely the idea of a sort of socially conservative idea of class, which is one of returning to place, ownership, one of a static social relations. So it's in that sense too, I think that the young male vote for far-right parties, it answers a social need. It answers an expectation of control, of ownership, of status. And that's precisely why I think it has to be seen as a reactionary backlash rather than a sort of radicalism which the left would be able, in its own way, to kind of harness or express. It's we often hear this kind of stereotype of, well, the left behind and abandoned are the people who are voting for far-right parties. In a sense, I think that idea of victimhood is one which is able also to mobilize voters who aren't necessarily so economically underprivileged, but who feel that their status is coming under attack and who feel that they are being left behind by urban, modern, cosmopolitan, etc. society. So I suppose I'm posing questions more than answers, but I think it's actually the heightened sense of competition itself which is producing these effects, rather than in terms of the growth of a reactionary backlash among a large section of young men, rather than necessarily the fact of economic decline, or them in fact being a sort of authentic working class voice, and so on. So I think that when we talk about class, it's very important to understand not just in terms of material deprivation, but also in terms of this like stereotyped vision of what it is to be a working class male, and the identity politics that have very successfully been built on that.
Many, many, many thanks, David. Also, you are right on time, because I wanted to finish my little moderation time before 15. What I would propose you, so we won't have time, I'm so very sorry, to open the room, to open the floor to the room. But what I suggest is that you have each 5 minutes. It's very short and it's always very frustrating. So if you agree and if you think you would have time for that, because it's a lot of work, but maybe we can use these 5 minutes to reflect on what everyone said. And then, because you won't have time to answer and to be, to correctly give an insight on what have been said, maybe if you could send me a short or extensive article. It depends on what's possible for you and what time you have. It would be amazing, because then we could have an output out of this discussion, and it would be less frustrating. And I think it would, give also some followings to the discussion. So if you agree, maybe we can do that. And so I give the floor in the same order, if it's okay for you. So Sara, then Francesca, and then David.
Oh, well, it's a bit of a shame because I have a lot of questions. So I don't know if I can reflect in 5 minutes on what's been said. I mean, I found both contributions by David and Francesca incredibly interesting and insightful. I mean, as I said, I really have questions, so maybe I will put them in form of questions, and if David and Francesca want to address them, great. But of course, don't feel you have to do it. So I think I was very. I mean, the data from that survey that you mentioned, Francesca, were really interesting. I was particularly struck by the one, I don't know which country was it from, what you said, 20% of men think that they will be worse off than their parents, and instead 56% of women think they will be better off. I thought it was such an interesting discrepancy, right? And I was wondering if you can maybe say a little bit more about that. I have also some comments about David. Again, I thought, I think, David, I'm really looking forward to reading what you're doing on, if I understood you correctly, what you are trying to work on this idea of class and how class has been reconfigured in the context of the rise of the far right. I think Alberto Toscano make a somewhat similar point. You probably read Late Fascism. I think he makes a somewhat similar point when he talks about class becoming an identity and having been very much used as an identity, very much in a context of identity politics or in identity politics style, if you like. And so I was wondering if you can maybe say something to that. But for me, the more interesting thing really, or the more interesting, but like what I've been also thinking a little bit myself is the issue of the work ethics in the following sense. If you read the work of Kathy Wicks or Kevin Floyd, the late Kevin Floyd, I don't know, not many people read it, unfortunately, and he passed away very young, just a few years ago, but he wrote this beautiful book called The Reification of Desire. And I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but in this book, he tried really to combine, he gives these reading of the concept of reification, but in connection with Judith Butler. So it's like one of these very strange experiments trying to combine Marxism and queer theory. But his point is quite compelling because he tries to see the differences between gender formations before neoliberalism and, sorry, under Fordism, or before Fordism and under Fordism. Sorry, I'm trying to also remember it myself. And one of the important points, I mean, it's completely uncontroversial, and I would say the same is also the same point is made also by Kathy Wicks, is how much the idea of the work ethics is important under Fordism. So under Fordism, you know, you have the formation of the nuclear family in which the man is the main breadwinner and the woman is mostly at home, or in any cases, the reserve army of labor. Her work is not as important for the family income as the male one. And that's completely uncontroversial. And according to Floyd, this leads to a formation of masculinity, which is different from the pre-Fordist one. And he has these very interesting dichotomies in which he says that under pre-Fordism, the opposite to manhood was childhood, whereas under Fordism, the kind of alter ego of manhood is womanhood. So it's really vis-a-vis these nuclear family formation that it becomes quite important. And in this context, work ethics for men was very important, to be industrious, working hard and productive, right? Now, my sense, and I know some people are working on this, is that at the moment, and particularly under neoliberalism, the message to young men, you have to work hard in order to have your little ownership of something, land or a house, in a way is no longer there. Or in a way it's been present. I mean, I think there is a sense in which this is not going to lead you anywhere. It's not working hard will not be enough to precisely give you that ownership of things that you want. And in that sense, I know some people are working more on this idea of it's a bad translation in English, but the idea of the speculative masculinity. By speculative, obviously, is a bad translation, but in Italian would be better understandable. So the idea of the gaming, men that want to make money very quickly, making little investments, or in any case, trying to do things that in fact do not correspond to the work ethics. Sorry for this convoluted question, but I guess my question is, especially to David, do you see this, and how does this in a way speak to also to what you are seeing in the message of the far right to young men in particular? Because I'm not entirely sure that I understood your point about the backlash. And I will just leave it there. I spoke too much. And as I said, I have mainly questions because I found it so interesting.
Thank you, Sarah. And you will also be able to send your questions by email if you want, because we all have the contacts of each other. Francesca, the floor is yours.
Yes, I will also try to stay within the 5 minutes. I promise. Actually, very interesting discussion, and of course, a lot of food for thoughts. And I think, so I will just reply very quickly to Sara's point about the data. I will just send you the report. Is actually, and it's from the UK, which I found particularly interesting. But this really resonates with, I mean, I am part of the millennials myself, and in a way, this type of like loss of future, of loss of kind of, rosy future perspective is something that, I mean, as an Italian who was 18 years old in 2008, when the economic crisis installed, this is kind of something that I find extremely relatable. I mean, it's something that I think it's very, very much part of of our experience as a generation. And of course, the gender discrepancy in this data is probably easily kind of explained as well by the fact that, of course, I mean, like women are very much like exiting from how can I say, like a world of a state of unfair competition that was so prominent before. And in a way, I think we really do have, like, we live in a more liberal society. So chances are that, on average, of course, women have better perspectives simply for the fact that they kind of massively accessed educations compared to the generations before. I mean, there is super interesting research also in the UK by Ford, who kind of showed exactly this, how the kind of educational trend is changing a lot of dynamics and gender dynamics at the micro, meso, macro level and so on. So that's something. I think I have like an input or like a perspective, like a thought on something that you mentioned in your talk at one point. It was the point about, okay, but why? So why trans women are the problem, or like why? And I kind of like the whole idea of the symbolic and not symbolic castration. I think there is also like another point that I think needs to be considered. Trans men are much less problematic because they actually reinforce patriarchal organizing of society. Of course, it's kind of who doesn't want to be a man because of the privilege that comes from being a man, right? So I think it's also like much less threatening exactly on the one hand because of this, right? It kind of reinforce patriarchal norm and reinforce like male supremacy or higher status in the gender hierarchies. And there is still something in very heteropatriarchal society about, men not performing as men are, so kind of is connected to the same type of, you can basically extend the discussions of, different type of stigma that gay population and lesbian population experience in society to the transgender population. So I think it's kind of very, like the dynamic is very, very similar there. And so in a way, I kind of really do agree that, of course, like trans women really poses like kind of a bigger threat in the sense that they are pretty much the embodiment of everything that, queer politics want to do in terms of like unpacking or like getting away from typical structures and also very, yeah, kind of heteronormative ways of and societal behavior. So that would be my kind of little comment on that. And then I have probably like a question, I don't know, like just a not such kind of something like on the top of my head for David as well, or kind of coming from David points. Exactly. I'm not sure like the extent to which, I mean, what we know is that, of course, like, I mean, lower status and lower income actually is one of the main predictor for far-right voting. So it's actually people who are kind of positionally belonging to the working class. But among the younger generation, this is not necessarily true. So again, I mean, kind of tapping into what Sara was mentioning, I mean, what is about the worker ethics exactly? Like we have very different, and also like what, you know, some kind of far rights with the old turbo capitalism, think about Milei in Argentina. We do have a lot of variation also in the type of kind of discourses that are provided. It's not really only about getting back to the small place and the small ownership, like the space, as you were mentioning, that of course has a lot of connection on the kind of secure spaces and the family, and the family as a nuclear, like as a kind of the basic kind of organization in society that provides security, which is of course very much present in far-right discourse. But there are a lot of other alternatives that are also kind of portrayed by far-right influencers. I mean, everything in the manospheres is really not about that type of work ethics that you are working on. If you think about, coaches on TikTok and so on, this is very different. So, I mean, I'm sure it works, and it works for a specific part of, the working class, or like men that kind of relate with this idea, but it cannot be like the only explanation that we have for this phenomena. And then it's like, okay, what do we do? I mean, what else? So yeah, that would be my point, and I shut up because I'm out of time, of course, already.
Many
Thank you.
No, it's okay. David, please take your 5 minutes, and then I will very, very, very shortly conclude. But take your 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well. Of course. I mean, I'm not saying that this is the only explanatory factor at all. But I mean, to specify a bit more what I mean. I mean, when I say working class identity, I don't think the working class identity is something that belongs inherently to lower income or lower status people or voters. I think that the working class identity is something that's mobilized even by millionaires, even by if we for example, I think I mentioned last time there's a survey of Republican voters from Pew, from US Republicans, sorry, from Pew from earlier this year, and it shows that Democrats are much less likely to call themselves working class than Republicans, right? And the main axes of differentiation are by education and income. However, the partisan association with working classness is so strong that even among the highest educated Republican voters earning over $12,000 a month, a majority call themselves working class, right? So they've been to university and they're earning huge amounts, but they call themselves working class. And I think the reason, what ties that together, is basically certain ideas, even ones drawn from the history of the labor movement and left, can be sort of remobilized in a right-wing key as an ideology of the work ethic, productivism, of basically like a sort of sense of underprivilege, but which may in fact be allied with being personally wealthy, right? Which is, you are someone who owns a business and is trying to work hard and get ahead, and you have obstacles in your way, whereas like the state is like a site of, or is politically seen as a site of distribution of unfair largesse and benefits to undeserving others. So what that right-wing politics of class creates is a kind of imaginary alliance between the deserving rich and the deserving poor against the undeserving elites and the undeserving poor. So, of course, there's many challenges to this model in different national cases. However, I think certainly I would say in very many Western countries, North American, European countries, the idea of working classness mattering as an identity, it's still kind of sticky in a certain way. It still endures even in a changed form. And Sara, you're right to mention Alberto Toscano's work, because of course he talks about this use of like the white working class as an identity. And of course his argument is like the white working class is not kind of like a sort of partial fulfillment of a solidaristic class identity. It's its opposite. It's built on the demise of class politics, right? It's the replacement of a politics of solidarity with an identity which is not only defined by victimhood rather than solidarity, but which actually also can be taken up by parts of even by obviously capitalist and billionaire interests, even of the type of like Donald Trump and so on. It's also true that much of the contemporary far right's imagery is not just, of course, when we talk about the far right's lack of social radicalism, it's easy to fall into the idea that it kind of doesn't have a sort of futuristic or utopian horizon, and parts of it do, right? There is a sort of like, in the sort of like, sort of Musk sort of idea, right? There is a sort of like techno-utopian version of far-right politics. And then, of course, there's also the entire sort of realm of like, crypto and sort of get-rich-quick schemes and so on. And so in that sense, the kind of speculative dimension is very real. At the same time, I think we should, it's important. I think, there's also a very strong element of contemporary far-right politics, which stresses precisely this kind of its idea of a sort of failed meritocracy. I think actually strongly relies on the appeal to a sort of a very material conception of a sort of norm of normality. So as one example of that, and the counterposing of its idea of the sort of hard-working, an example of my point about the sort of mobilization of the like work ethic idea would be, for example, the way in which far-right influencers and so on talk about STEM subjects compared to humanities in universities, right? Like humanities are the domain of idle speculation, to use the other version of the word speculation. Like humanities are the realm of like idle social commentary by people who don't do anything and are like female coded, whereas STEM subjects are like practical and material and make things happen. So I think that it's a male coded. And of course, that this ideological framing is imposed upon and correlates with a real gender divide in the take-up of those subjects. So that's just one example. But I guess what I'm saying is that a certain idea of the productivist and real economy mobilizes certain stereotypes of what the working class is and has always been, which remain sort of politically compelling, and also provide a certain kind of political grammar which the left has a hard time responding to. Like in Britain in particular, where the expression of class as a sort of collection of cultural signifiers is particularly pronounced. We very often have this kind of spectacle of, for example, Zach Polanski from the Greens, or Sara Sultana, the left-wing MP, or any number of sort of left-wing or social movement representatives being sort of angrily derided by a middle-aged person with a regional accent, saying, "Oh, well, you're the middle class, overeducated, but don't really know anything." And I think that kind of those kind of assumptions are very strongly present in British politics and in the kind of rhetoric of the contemporary far right. So of course they play out differently in different national contexts, but I mean to say that the mobilization of this kind of identity politics isn't just about appealing to the underprivileged, but creates a kind of affect and a kind of framing on which the far right has been very successful in claiming the idea of working class representation and claiming to represent the hardworking, etc., in a way which the left currently really struggles to respond to.
Many thank David. I will not add anything to the discussion because we already are ahead of time, but I want really to thank you again for the time you committed to this discussion. I think it was a really insightful one, and I really do hope we can have further discussions in the future, and maybe some outputs if you want, and if you have the time and energy. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you again and let you thank you also, and then I will just conclude like that.
Yeah, I was reading the comment by Andrea in the chat. So because I'll just paste it in my notes because I want to read it more closely. But I just want to say, because there is not much time for discussion, Andrea, if you want to send me an email, we can maybe have a chat about this because it sounds very interesting. I don't know exactly what's going on. I mean, I'm less familiar with the Portuguese context, but this sounds, yeah, I'm quite interested in this idea of the swerfist agenda. So I will familiarize myself a little bit more with this, but thank you very much.
Very nice. Many thanks again, and have a very nice day, and talk soon.
Yep.
Thank you so much,
everyone.
Anaïs. Thank you.
And
Thanks,
thank you for moderating.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.